Years' War was a conflict like no other. It wasn't just a clash of swords and cannons, but a battle for the soul of Europe. A war that began over religion, but soon spiraled into a fight for power, territory, and survival. Entire cities were razed, fields were turned to ash, and millions of lives were lost. For 3 decades, Europe found itself in the grip of a seemingly endless conflict that would reshape the continent in ways no one could have imagined. This was not just a war of armies, but of ideas. Ideas about faith, governance, and what it meant to rule. It left scars that ran deep, not just in the soil of Europe, but in its very identity. At the heart of it all were 2 dominant forces, the Catholics and the Protestants, locked in a bitter struggle for religious supremacy. But it was also a war of empires, with the mighty Habsburgs fighting to maintain their dominance, while other nations sought to break free from their grip. It was a conflict that reached beyond the battlefield and into the halls of power, shaking the foundations of monarchies, shifting alliances, and setting the stage for modern Europe. Welcome to ASMR History. Today, I'm excited to take you on a journey through the intricate and often tumultuous history of the 30 Years' War. As always, I'll be balancing the richness of historical detail with the calming, soothing tone that defines this channel. Whether you're here to learn or simply to relax, you're in the perfect place. In this 5-part series, we'll be unraveling the complex layers of this war, its causes, its key players, and its devastating consequences. Each episode will dive deep into the major conflicts, the political maneuvers behind them, and the pivotal battles that changed the course of history. Together, we'll explore how the war wasn't just a series of skirmishes, but a chain of events that shaped the future of Europe. From the Defenestration of Prague, which sparked rebellion, to the treaties that finally brought an uneasy peace, we'll walk through the blood-soaked battlefields and the courtrooms where decisions were made that changed the fate of nations. But why, you might ask, should we care about a war that happened centuries ago? The answer lies in its impact. The 30 Years' War was one of the most devastating conflicts in European history, with ripple effects that can still be felt today. It altered the balance of power, cemented religious divisions, and left behind a Europe forever changed. This war brought the principle of Westphalian sovereignty into the world, where states would be recognised as having authority over their territories without external interference, a concept that still defines international politics to this day. Yet, the importance of the 30 Years' War is not just in its political ramifications. The human cost was staggering. Entire regions were decimated. Famine and disease swept through the land as armies marched across Europe, leaving destruction in their wake. It's estimated that the war claimed the lives of nearly 8 million people, a number that underscores the profound suffering endured during these 30 long years. The economies of many states were in ruins, and social order broke down uncover the stories of emperors, kings, generals, and common folk caught in the crossfire. Each episode will zoom in on specific phases of the war, giving you a front row seat to the dramatic events that shaped the conflict. From the Battle of White Mountain to the Peace of Westphalia, we will dissect the key moments that define this era. Now that we've set the stage for what's to come, let's step back to where it all began. How did Europe find itself on the brink of such a cataclysmic conflict? The answer lies in a complex web of religious and political tensions, where Protestant and Catholic forces squared off, and the mighty Habsburg dynasty sought to maintain their iron grip on Europe. As these tensions simmered, it was only a matter of time before the flames of war were ignited. By the early 17th century, Europe was a powder keg, with religious and political tensions simmering just beneath the surface. At the heart of this conflict were two rival visions for the continent, one Catholic, the other Protestant. These tensions had been building for over a century, ever since Martin Luther nailed his 95 Theses to a church door in Wittenberg and ignited the Protestant Reformation. Luther's defiance of the Catholic Church sparked a wave of religious change, as men like John Calvin and others joined the call to reform what they saw as a corrupt and misguided institution. Across Europe, people began to question the authority of the Pope, and many embraced new forms of Christianity that rejected the Church's dominance. The Protestant Reformation didn't just change hearts and minds, it fractured Europe's once unified religious landscape. What had been a mostly Catholic continent was now a patchwork of religious allegiances. Protestantism spread rapidly, especially in Northern Europe, creating a deep divide between Protestant states like Sweden, Denmark, and parts of the Holy Roman Empire, and the still dominant Catholic powers like Spain, Austria, and Bavaria. This divide wasn't just theological, it became political, as religious differences started to fuel long-standing rivalries between Europe's great powers. In response to the growing threat posed by Protestantism, the Catholic Church launched its own counter-offensive, the Counter-Reformation. Led by fervent reformers like Ignatius of Loyola, who founded the Jesuit order, the Catholic Church sought to win back the regions it had lost to the Protestant cause. The Council of Trent, held between 1545 and 1563, became a centerpiece of this effort. The Church clarified its doctrines, reasserted its authority, and worked to root out corruption within its ranks, all while ramping up efforts to suppress Protestant movements through both persuasion and force. The Catholic-Protestant divide was no longer just a matter of faith. It had evolved into a political struggle for the very soul of Europe. Nowhere was this divide more pronounced than in the Holy Roman Empire. A sprawling patchwork of territories stretching across Central Europe, the Holy Roman Empire was a land where religious and political allegiances were constantly in flux. The empire was technically ruled by an emperor, but in reality, the power of the Holy Roman Emperor was limited. The empire was so decentralized some states remained fiercely Catholic, while others embraced Protestantism. The Peace of Augsburg in 1555 was an attempt to calm these religious tensions, allowing each prince to choose the religion of their own territory. It was an uneasy truce that held for a time, but was ultimately flawed. The settlement only recognised two forms of Christianity: Catholicism and Lutheranism, leaving out other Protestant sects like Calvinism, which began to gain influence. Furthermore, the peace was built on the fragile premise that political and religious unity could coexist in such a divided empire. It did little to heal the deepening fractures between Protestant and Catholic states, and as Calvinism spread through regions like the Palatinate, those tensions escalated. Enter Ferdinand Tode, a man whose name would become synonymous with the 30 Years' War. As a devout Catholic and a member of the powerful Habsburg dynasty, Ferdinand had one clear goal: to restore Catholicism as the dominant faith in the Holy Roman Empire. When he became emperor in 1619, he set out on an aggressive campaign to centralise power and roll back the gains made by Protestant states. His policies alienated Protestant princes, who viewed him not only as a threat to their religious freedoms, but also as a ruler intent on stripping away their autonomy. One of the most notable opponents of Ferdinand's policies was Frederick the Elector of the Palatinate and leader of the Protestant Union. Frederick saw himself as a defender of the Protestant cause, a man destined to resist the growing influence of the Habsburgs. His role in the early years of the war would prove pivotal, as he took up the mantle of resistance against Ferdinand's centralisation efforts. With tensions rising across the empire, Protestant and Catholic states began to prepare for the inevitable confrontation that lay ahead. But this conflict was never just a local affair. As religious divisions deepened within the Holy Roman Empire, Europe's great powers began to take sides. Spain, another Habsburg-controlled Catholic power, threw its full weight behind Ferdinand's efforts to crush Protestant resistance. Meanwhile, France, despite being a Catholic nation, saw an opportunity to weaken its Habsburg rivals. Under the guidance of Cardinal Richelieu, France began covertly supporting Protestant states, not out of religious solidarity, but to undermine the Habsburgs and shift the balance of power in Europe. In the north, Protestant powers like Sweden and Denmark also took an interest in the growing conflict. These nations had their own motivations, largely shaped by a desire to curb Habsburg influence and protect Protestant interests in the empire. Sweden, under the leadership of King Gustavus Adolphus, would later play a crucial role in turning the tide of the war, bringing both military might and a passionate commitment to the Protestant cause. Historians have long debated whether the 30 Years' War was truly about religion, or if it was, in fact, a struggle for political dominance. C.V. Wedgwood, one of the foremost historians of the conflict, famously wrote, "The war, which began as a religious conflict, evolved into a struggle for across Europe. Indeed, while religion was the spark that ignited the war, political ambitions soon took centre stage. Peter H. Wilson, another historian of the period, emphasised the complex interplay between faith and power in the conflict, arguing that the two were inseparable in early modern Europe. What began as a clash between Catholics and Protestants quickly morphed into a broader struggle for control over the future of Europe. As alliances formed and armies prepared for battle, Europe teetered on the brink of chaos. The peace that had been tenuously maintained for decades was about to shatter. The first blow would come in a small room in Prague, where the future of the Holy Roman Empire, and indeed all of Europe, would be decided by a single violent act. The Defenestration of Prague was about to spark a conflict that would consume Europe for 30 long, bloody years. By the early 17th century, tensions in the Kingdom of Bohemia had reached a boiling point. The region, a part of the sprawling Holy Roman Empire, was a volatile mix of religious and political discontent. Protestant nobles, long wary of the Catholic Habsburg dynasty's rule, felt increasingly marginalised. While Bohemia had a history of religious diversity, the rise of Catholic power under Habsburg control seemed to threaten their rights. For these Protestant nobles, the 1609 Letter of Majesty was supposed to be a guarantee of religious freedom. Issued by Emperor Rudolf II, it promised Bohemia's Protestant estates the right to practice their faith without fear of persecution. Yet, in the years following its signing, those promises seemed to ring hollow. Ferdinand II, a staunch Catholic with ambitions of restoring Catholic dominance throughout the empire, was elected King of Bohemia in 1617. This was a clear signal to the Protestant nobles that their days of religious freedom might be numbered. Ferdinand's policies increasingly favoured Catholicism, and many Protestant leaders feared that the rights granted by the Letter of Majesty would soon be stripped away. In their eyes, Bohemia was standing at the edge of a precipice. It was only a matter of time before something or someone would push it over. That moment came on May 23rd, 1618, in the city of Prague. A group of Protestant nobles, outraged by the actions of Catholic officials who they believed were undermining the Letter of Majesty, gathered at the royal castle. Their target, two Catholic regents, Wilhelm Slavata and Yaroslav Martinic, who had been appointed by the Habsburgs to enforce their authority in Bohemia. Tensions were high as the Protestant nobles stormed into the council chamber where the two men sat. Voices were raised, accusations flew, and in a fit of fury, the nobles decided to take matters into their own hands, quite literally. Without warning, they seized Slavata and Martinic, dragged them across the room, and hurled them out of the castle window. The two men fell approximately 70 feet, crashing into the moat below. Remarkably, both survived, landing on what some claimed was a heap of manure that cushioned their fall. Catholics would later say it was divine intervention that spared their lives, while Protestants insisted it was nothing more than sheer luck. Whatever the truth, the event became known as the Defenestration of Prague, and it would be the spark that set Europe ablaze. In the immediate aftermath, chaos erupted. News of this defenestration spread quickly, sending shockwaves through both Protestant and Catholic camps. For Ferdinand II, now the Holy Roman Emperor, this was an unforgivable act of rebellion. He viewed the defenestration as a direct challenge to his authority and a declaration of war by the Protestant estates. Outraged, he wasted no time in mustering an army to crush the Bohemian Revolt and reassert Habsburg control over the region. On the Protestant side, the defenestration was seen as a bold and necessary act of defiance. The nobles who had thrown the Catholic officials from the window were hailed as heroes, standing up to the oppressive Habsburg regime. Protestants across Bohemia rallied to their cause, forming alliances and preparing for the inevitable clash with imperial forces. The Bohemian estates, now in open rebellion, sought support from Protestant states across Europe, hoping to turn what had begun as a local conflict into a broader Protestant alliance against Catholic hegemony. The Defenestration of Prague, while dramatic, was not just a symbolic gesture. It marked the point of no return in Bohemia's simmering tensions. What had been a series of political manoeuvres and religious grievances was now a full-blown revolt. As historian Peter H. Wilson put it, the Defenestration of Prague ignited a wider European conflict that would last for decades. Indeed, what began as a local struggle in the heart of Central Europe soon spiraled into a war that would engulf the entire continent. Both sides quickly mobilized their forces. The Catholic Habsburgs, backed by the might of Spain and Bavaria, prepared to stamp out the Protestant rebellion in Bohemia. Meanwhile, the Protestant estates, led by figures like Frederick the Hood of the Palatinate, scrambled to defend their cause. Armies began to gather, alliances were forged, and the first skirmishes broke out across Bohemia. The stage was set for a conflict that would devastate Europe for the next 30 years. As tensions rose, it became clear that this was no longer just about Bohemia. The Defenestration of Prague had opened a Pandora's box, unleashing centuries-old rivalries and ambitions. Protestant and Catholic powers across Europe began to take sides, knowing that the outcome of this conflict could reshape the balance of power on the continent. What started as a protest over religious rights in Bohemia quickly became a struggle for the future of Europe itself. For Ferdinand II, crushing the Bohemian Rebellion was about more than just maintaining control over a single region. It was part of a larger vision to restore Catholic dominance throughout the Holy Roman Empire. He was determined to make an example of the Bohemians, to show that any challenge to Habsburg authority would be met with swift and brutal force. But the Protestant nobles of Bohemia had no intention of backing down. They believed that they were fighting not only for their religious freedom, but for the survival of Protestantism in Central Europe. As the armies gathered and the battle lines were drawn, Europe watched anxiously. The first sparks of war had been lit, but the full inferno was still to come. Protestant and Catholic leaders alike knew that what happened in Bohemia would reverberate far beyond its borders. The Defenestration of Prague had set in motion a chain of events that could not be undone. War was inevitable, and it would not be long before the entire continent was consumed by it. The defenestration had been the match that ignited the flames, but it was the Bohemian Revolt that would turn those flames into a roaring inferno. As the revolt spread beyond Prague, drawing in new allies and adversaries, it became clear that this was no isolated conflict. It was the beginning of something far larger, a war that would reshape Europe for generations to come. As the dust settled after the dramatic defenestration of Prague, Bohemia found itself standing on the precipice of open rebellion. What had started as an explosive act of defiance had now turned into a full-blown revolt against the powerful Habsburg dynasty. For the Protestant nobles of Bohemia, the choice was clear: submit to a future of Catholic domination, or rise up and fight to protect their religious freedoms and political autonomy. These nobles, many of whom had long chafed under the heavy hand of Habsburg rule, were driven by a mixture of both fear and frustration. They had watched with growing alarm as Emperor Ferdinand II, a devout Catholic, made it clear that his reign would not tolerate Protestantism in any form. Religion was at the heart of the rebellion, but it was not the only factor. The Bohemian nobles were just as concerned about the erosion of their political rights. The Habsburgs had been steadily centralizing power, stripping away the traditional privileges that the Bohemian estates had long enjoyed. These nobles, accustomed to a degree of autonomy in governing their lands, saw Ferdinand's efforts to strengthen imperial control as a direct threat to their status and influence. This dual fear of religious persecution and political subjugation lit the fires of revolt across the kingdom. The Protestant nobles were determined to push back against what they saw as an existential threat to their way of life. Faced with the possibility of war, the Bohemian leaders made a bold and fateful decision. They deposed Ferdinand as their king and turned to Frederick, the Elector of the Palatinate, to lead their cause. Frederick, a young and ambitious Protestant prince, was a natural choice. He was not only a prominent member of the Protestant Union, a coalition of German Protestant states, but also the son-in-law of King James III of England. To the Bohemian nobles, Frederick represented the hope of a wider Protestant alliance, an opportunity to rally other Protestant nations to their side and build a united front against the Catholic Habsburgs. Frederick, however, was hesitant. His advisors warned him that accepting the Bohemian crown would provoke the wrath of the powerful Habsburgs and plunge Europe into a larger conflict. But the lure of the crown and the possibility of leading a grand Protestant coalition was too tempting to resist. Protestant nobles. For them, Frederick's election marked a turning point, a chance to secure their future under a Protestant monarch who would defend their faith and their rights. But what they saw as a beacon of hope, the Habsburgs viewed as a direct and dangerous challenge to their authority. War now seemed inevitable. Both sides began to raise armies, preparing for the coming storm. On one side stood the Habsburg forces, led by seasoned generals like Johann Cercles, Count of Tilly, and bolstered by allies from Catholic Spain and Bavaria. Ferdinand II, furious at the audacity of the Bohemian nobles, was determined to crush the rebellion and reassert Catholic dominance in his empire. For him, the Bohemian Revolt was not just about regaining control of a rebellious province. It was about sending a message to all Protestant states within the Holy Roman Empire that rebellion would not be tolerated. On the other side, the Protestant forces in Bohemia scrambled to organise. They faced a daunting task. While the Protestant nobles were united in their determination to resist Habsburg rule, they were less experienced in military affairs than their Catholic counterparts. Still, there was hope. Frederick V, now dubbed the Winter King for the briefness of his reign, worked to rally support from his Protestant allies across Europe. The Protestant Union offered some assistance, and hopes were high that other Protestant powers, like England and the Dutch Republic, would come to their aid. But as the conflict grew, it became clear that Bohemia would not be fighting alone. The revolt sparked a much larger conflict, drawing in nations from across the continent as religious and political allegiances began to shift. The Bohemian Revolt was quickly becoming more than a regional uprising. It was, as historian Friedrich Schiller would later write, a harbinger of the division of Europe along religious lines. What had begun as a struggle between Protestants and Catholics in Bohemia now threatened to engulf all of Europe in a war of religion and power. Protestant and Catholic states across the Holy Roman Empire began to take sides, knowing that the outcome of the Bohemian Revolt would have far-reaching consequences for the entire continent. The mobilization of armies marked the beginning of what would become one of the most devastating conflicts in European history. On the Habsburg side, Ferdinand Tone's forces were well trained and well funded. The Catholic League, a coalition of Catholic states within the empire, stood ready to support Ferdinand in his campaign to crush the Protestant rebellion. Spain, another Catholic ally, sent troops and resources to bolster the Habsburg effort, viewing the revolt as an opportunity to strengthen their influence in Central Europe. The Protestant forces, meanwhile, were less unified and far less experienced in the art of war. The Bohemian nobles who had led the rebellion were not military men, and while Frederick III had some connections to the Protestant Union, he lacked the resources and military expertise to mount a serious challenge to the Habsburgs on his own. Still, the Protestants in Bohemia were determined to fight. They raised armies from among their own ranks, calling upon local militias and seeking aid from Protestant states watched the events in Bohemia closely, knowing that the outcome of the revolt could shape the future of Protestantism in Northern Europe. As both sides prepared for battle, it became clear that the Bohemian Revolt was the opening act of a much larger drama. The conflict that had begun in Prague was now spreading beyond the borders of Bohemia, drawing in neighbouring states and threatening to plunge all of Europe into war. For Frederick V, the stakes could not have been higher. His reign as King of Bohemia, which had begun with such promise, now seemed precarious as the Habsburg forces marched toward his newly claimed kingdom. Ferdinand II, on the other hand, was confident. He believed that with the support of the Catholic League and his allies in Spain, he could crush the Bohemian Rebellion swiftly and decisively. The Catholic forces were better organised, better trained, and better equipped than their Protestant counterparts. Ferdinand was determined to reclaim Bohemia and restore Catholic order to his empire, even if it meant reducing the kingdom to rubble. The Bohemian nobles, though, refused to surrender. They had risked everything in their revolt against the Habsburgs, and they were prepared to defend their land and their faith to the last man. For them, this was not just a political struggle, it was a fight for their very survival. If Ferdinand succeeded in crushing the revolt, it would mean the end of Protestantism in Bohemia and the triumph of Catholic absolutism throughout the Holy Roman Empire. As both Protestant and Catholic forces gathered for battle, Europe braced for what was to come. The Bohemian Revolt had become the flashpoint of a much larger conflict, a war that would determine the future of religion and power on the continent. The first major confrontation was about to take place on the rolling hills outside of Prague, at a site that would become infamous in the annals of European history. The Battle of White Mountain was looming on the horizon, and its outcome would change the course of the 30 Years' War. The morning of November 8th, 1620, dawned cold and overcast on the outskirts of Prague. On a small rise known as White Mountain, two armies prepared for battle, both knowing the stakes couldn't be higher. For the Catholic forces, led by the formidable General Johann Cercles, Count of Tilly, the mission was clear: crush the Protestant rebellion once and for all, and reassert Habsburg dominance over Bohemia. For the Protestant forces, cobbled together in desperation and led by Christian of Anhalt, it was a final stand, a last chance to defend their cause, their faith, and their independence. The Battle of White Mountain would determine the fate of Bohemia, but it would also set the stage for the next phase of the 30 Years' War, shaping the conflict's future in ways no one could have predicted. Bohemia was the heart of the rebellion against Habsburg rule, and the Catholic forces knew that if they could break the Bohemian resistance here, they could send a clear message to the rest of Europe. The strategic importance of the battle was undeniable. Situated just outside of Prague, White Mountain controlled the approach to the city, making it a critical location for both sides. If the Catholics won, Prague would fall, and with it, the hopes of the Protestant cause in Bohemia. The Protestants, on the other hand, were fighting not just to protect their capital, but to preserve their religious freedom and their political autonomy. The stage was set for a decisive confrontation. On one side of the battlefield stood the Catholic League's army, a well-organised and battle-hardened force, led by General Tilly, a man known for his ruthless efficiency and tactical brilliance. The Catholic army had the clear advantage. Tilly's troops were disciplined, experienced, and well-equipped, a stark contrast to the disorganised Protestant forces facing them. Tilly had been preparing for this moment for months, knowing that this battle could determine the fate of the entire rebellion. His army, bolstered by Habsburg and Bavarian support, was ready to strike a devastating blow. In contrast, the Protestant forces, led by Christian of Anhalt, were a shadow of what they had hoped to be. Anhalt, while a capable politician, was no seasoned military commander, and his army reflected that. The Protestant forces were a ragtag coalition of Bohemian militias and mercenaries, poorly equipped and lacking the discipline of their Catholic counterparts. Morale was low, and many of the soldiers were inexperienced, facing their first real battle. Anhalt's army had been hastily assembled in the hopes of defending Prague, but it was clear to those watching from the sidelines that they were outmatched. As the battle began, Tilly wasted no time in pressing his advantage. His forces moved with precision, using the hilly terrain of White Mountain to their benefit. The Catholic infantry advanced in well-coordinated formations, supported by artillery that rained destruction on the Protestant lines. Anhalt's forces, by contrast, struggled to maintain cohesion. Lacking a clear strategy and hampered by poor leadership, the Protestant army faltered almost from the start. Tilly's forces exploited every weakness, breaking through the Protestant defences and driving them back towards Prague. The Protestant cavalry, meant to be their trump card, was scattered by a decisive Catholic charge, leaving the infantry exposed. In just 2 hours, the fate of the battle and Bohemia was sealed. The Protestant army crumbled under the weight of the Catholic assault, and the battlefield became a scene of chaos and bloodshed. As Tilly's forces swept over the broken lines of the Bohemian defenders, the once hopeful Protestant cause lay in ruins. Christian of Anhalt's troops, demoralised and disorganised, fled the field, leaving thousands of their comrades dead or dying on the slopes of White Mountain. The defeat was swift and brutal, and the consequences for Bohemia were immediate. General Tilly, surveying the battlefield after the victory, reportedly remarked, "This battle has decided the fate of Bohemia." He was not wrong. The defeat at White Mountain marked the end of Bohemian independence and the beginning of a harsh and prolonged period of Catholic domination. In the immediate aftermath, the Habsburgs moved quickly to consolidate their power. Ferdinand II, the Holy Roman Emperor, saw the battle as a vindication of his efforts to restore Catholic control over his empire. He wasted no time in punishing those who had rebelled against him. The consequences for Bohemia were devastating. In the wake of the Protestant defeat, Ferdinand launched a campaign of repression aimed at wiping out any remaining resistance to Habsburg rule. The leaders of the revolt were captured and executed, their heads displayed on pikes in Prague as a grim warning to others who might consider defying the emperor. Protestantism, once a powerful force in Bohemia, was systematically crushed. Ferdinand imposed Catholicism as the state religion, forcing Protestant nobles to convert or flee. Those who resisted were stripped of their lands and titles, their wealth and influence confiscated by the Catholic elite. Within a few years, Bohemia, once a bastion of religious diversity, was transformed into a staunchly Catholic state under Habsburg control. The defeat at White Mountain also had broader implications for the 30 Years' War. In the early stages of the conflict, the Catholic forces, buoyed by their victory in Bohemia, gained the upper hand. Ferdinand II's success in crushing the Bohemian Revolt emboldened him, and Catholic armies across Europe began to push back against Protestant forces. The war, which had begun as a localized conflict in Bohemia, now expanded as Protestant states elsewhere in Europe watched in horror as their Bohemian allies were defeated. The Catholic victory sent shockwaves through Protestant Europe, prompting nations like Denmark, Sweden, and the Dutch Republic to reconsider their involvement in the conflict. For the Protestant cause, the loss of Bohemia was a significant blow. The defeat at White Mountain weakened Protestant resistance across the Holy Roman Empire and gave the Catholic forces a sense of momentum that would carry them into the next phase of the war. It also underscored the growing power of the Habsburg dynasty, which now controlled much of Central Europe. But while the Battle of White Mountain was a decisive victory for the Catholics, it was by no means the end of the war. The conflict would drag on for another 28 years as Protestant forces regrouped and new alliances were forged. The battle also revealed the deep divisions within Europe, divisions that went far beyond religion. The 30 Years' War was as much a political struggle as it was a religious one, and the defeat at White Mountain highlighted the complexities of the conflict. Protestant leaders across Europe recognized that they were not just fighting for religious freedom, they were fighting to resist the growing dominance of the Habsburgs and their Catholic allies. The battle had ended in defeat, but the war was far from over. As the smoke cleared from the battlefield, the full weight of the Catholic victory began to settle in. The repression that followed was swift and brutal, with Bohemia forced to submit to a new Catholic order. Yet, the Habsburgs were not content with merely subduing Bohemia. Their victory gave them the momentum they needed to consolidate their power across the Holy Roman Empire. The stage was now set for a wider conflict as Protestant and Catholic forces forces across Europe prepared for the next round of fighting. The Battle of White Mountain was more than just a military victory. It marked a turning point that allowed Ferdinand turned and the Habsburg dynasty to tighten their grip on Bohemia and, by extension, much of Central Europe. With Protestant resistance crushed on the battlefield, the next phase of the struggle unfolded, not with swords and cannons, but with laws and edicts. The aftermath of the battle saw Ferdinand embark on a systematic campaign to eliminate Protestantism from Bohemia altogether, securing not only his political dominance, but also enforcing religious conformity under the Catholic Church. In the wake of the Protestant defeat, Ferdinand wasted no time in dismantling the power structures that had supported the rebellion. One of the most immediate actions he took was the wholesale confiscation of Protestant lands. The nobility who had supported the revolt was stripped of their estates, their wealth, and their influence. These confiscated lands were then redistributed to loyal Catholic nobles and to the Church itself, ensuring that those who held power in Bohemia were now firmly aligned with the Habsburg regime. The loss of land not only crippled the Protestant elite economically, but also removed their ability to mobilize future resistance. But land confiscation was just the beginning. For Ferdinand, the rebellion had been more than a political challenge. It was a spiritual affront. As a devout Catholic, he viewed the Protestant presence in Bohemia as a stain on the true faith. To cleanse his realm of heresy, Ferdinand embarked on an aggressive campaign of forced conversions. Protestant nobles who wished to retain their titles and privileges were given a choice: convert to Catholicism or face exile. Many chose the latter, fleeing Bohemia rather than renounce their faith. Those who stayed were compelled to attend Catholic Mass and submit to the authority of the Church. For the common people, the conversion process was no less harsh. Protestant ministers were expelled, churches were seized and reconsecrated, and religious practices outside the Catholic faith were banned. Within a generation, Protestantism had all but disappeared from Bohemia, replaced by the iron hand of Catholic orthodoxy. Ferdinand's success in Bohemia was more than a religious victory. It also represented a major political consolidation of Habsburg power. The defeat of the Bohemian nobles gave him the opportunity to centralize authority within the Holy Roman Empire, further weakening the autonomy of the various principalities and duchies that had long resisted imperial control. What had once been a loosely bound collection of semi-independent states was now being drawn more tightly under the Habsburg banner. Ferdinand's victory sent a clear message, not just to Bohemia, but to the entire empire. Rebellion would be met with swift and severe consequences, and the Habsburgs would tolerate no dissent, either religious or political. This consolidation of power had far-reaching implications for the future of Europe. With Bohemia now firmly under Catholic control, the Habsburgs had a secure base from which to project religious norm was treated as treasonous. The Peace of Augsburg, which had attempted to bring some balance between Protestant and Catholic states within the empire, was effectively nullified in Bohemia. Religious pluralism was no longer an option under Habsburg rule. In reflecting on his victory and the subsequent crackdown, Ferdinand II famously remarked, "The true faith shall be restored, not by the sword alone, but through divine grace and political unity." For Ferdinand, the consolidation of power in Bohemia was not just a matter of political expediency. It was a divine mission to restore what he saw as the rightful order of the world. He believed that his rule was ordained by God, and that the Catholic faith was the only legitimate expression of Christianity. This intertwining of religious fervour and political ambition drove much of Ferdinand's decision-making in the years following the Battle of White Mountain. The repercussions of this consolidation reverberated across Europe. For Protestant states, the defeat in Bohemia was a sobering reminder of the Catholic League's strength and the Habsburgs' determination to reassert control over the Holy Roman Empire. Protestant rulers in Denmark, Sweden, and elsewhere began to rethink their strategies, knowing that Ferdinand's victory in Bohemia could easily be replicated elsewhere if they did not act. The stage was set for the next phase of the 30 Years' War, as Protestant forces regrouped and sought new alliances to counter the growing dominance of the Catholic Habsburgs. Yet, the Catholic victory was not without its challenges. The repression in Bohemia created a legacy of bitterness and resentment that would linger for generations. The forced conversions, land seizures, and political centralization left many feeling oppressed under the Habsburg regime. While outwardly Bohemia appeared pacified, the memory of the rebellion and the heavy-handed measures that followed fueled a simmering discontent that would never fully disappear. The cracks in the Habsburg edifice were still there, waiting for the right moment to re-emerge. As Ferdinand II and his Catholic allies celebrated their triumph, the rest of Europe braced for what was to come. The consolidation of power in Bohemia was a victory, but it was just one chapter in a much larger conflict. The 30 Years' War was far from over, and the battle lines were shifting once again. Protestant forces, watching from the sidelines, would not let the defeat in Bohemia stand uncontested. They were already planning their next moves, preparing for the inevitable clashes that would define the next phase of the war. The triumph of Catholicism in Bohemia had set the stage for further conflict, and Europe was ready to explode once more. As the dust settled over the ruins of Prague and the Habsburgs tightened their grip, new alliances were being formed, new strategies devised. The war would rage on, drawing more nations into its bloody vortex and reshaping the continent in ways that no one could have predicted. The next episode in this epic struggle was about to begin. The 30 Years' War is a story filled with rebellion, shifting alliances, and the relentless struggle for power. that sparked a chain reaction. From there, the Bohemian Revolt rose, with Protestant leaders rallying around Frederick V, hoping to carve out a future free from Habsburg control. But their hopes were shattered at the Battle of White Mountain, where Catholic forces delivered a decisive blow, leading to the consolidation of Habsburg power and the repression of Protestantism in Bohemia. As we reflect on these events, it's clear that this was only the beginning. The defeat in Bohemia set the stage for a much larger conflict, and soon Denmark will step into the fray. In the next episode, we'll explore the Danish intervention and how King Christian IV's involvement escalated the war, dragging more nations into the chaos and widening the scope of the conflict across Europe. If you've enjoyed this journey through history, be sure to subscribe to ASMR History. We'll continue to explore the fascinating twists and turns of the 30 Years' War.